My billionaire stepson blackmailed me to cheat on his father with him. Until this happened. Inside, Amanda stood frozen, staring at the message on her phone. Meet me at room 405, Hilton Hotel. Midnight, where your secret goes public. Her fingers tightened around the phone, her heart slamming against her ribs. The sender, Brian, her stepson. The air in the room felt too thick, suffocating. This wasn't just a random threat. It was a direct attack. Brian wasn't just some rich man's spoiled son. He was dangerous, manipulative, and worst of all, he knew. Amanda had spent years keeping her past buried. Every step she took, every carefully crafted lie, had been to protect her place in Chief Douglas's life. And now, in a single text, it all threatened to crumble. She knew what Brian was. A fraudster, a criminal hiding behind designer suits and luxury cars. His wealth wasn't built on hard work like his father's. It was stolen, drained from helpless victims through internet scams. And yet, here he was, holding her life in his hands. She had no choice. She had to go. The hotel lobby smelled of roses and power, silent, undeniable wealth. Amanda walked in, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Each step felt like walking toward a noose. As the elevator doors slid open, she hesitated. The walls inside gleamed, reflecting her pale face. This is a trap. But what choice did she have? With a deep breath, she stepped inside. Room 405. The door was slightly open. Amanda stood there for a moment, her pulse hammering in her ears. She should turn back. She should leave. But before she could decide, the door swung open wider. Brian stood there, leaning lazily against the frame. His silk robe hung loosely, exposing his toned chest. A glass of whiskey dangled from his fingers. Right on time, he said, smirking. Amanda didn't move. What do you want, Brian? His eyes darkened with amusement. Come in and find out. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn. The soft hum of city life outside felt like a distant dream, completely disconnected from the nightmare unfolding here. Brian closed the door, locking it with a slow, deliberate click. Amanda turned sharply. Why am I here? He took a sip of his drink, eyes never leaving hers. Because you don't want my father to know the truth. She swallowed. What truth? His smirk widened. He reached for his phone, tapped the screen, and turned it toward her. Amanda's stomach dropped. A video. Her. With a man who was not her husband. Her hands turned cold. Where did you get this? Brian stepped closer, his voice dripping with amusement. Doesn't matter. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps. She had spent years keeping this buried. And now this? You wouldn't, she whispered. His fingers grazed her cheek. Wouldn't I? Amanda slapped his hand away. What do you want? Brian set his drink down, tilting his head. I think you already know. She took a step back. You're insane. He chuckled. Maybe, but that doesn't change your situation, does it? Her mind raced. She had to find a way out. She had to. But then Brian moved. Fast. Before she could react, he had her pinned against the wall. Her pulse skyrocketed. Say no. And I press send. He whispered against her ear, his breath warm against her skin. Amanda's hands trembled. Brian, please. He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. No need to beg, he murmured. Just comply. She felt her world shatter around her. And then, she did. Midnight passed like a slow, ticking bomb. Brian lay back against the pillows, watching Amanda as she sat at the edge of the bed, her face unreadable. He traced patterns on his chest, eyes glinting with satisfaction. You're full of surprises, he mused. Amanda said nothing. She felt hollow, like a puppet with its strings cut. Brian rolled over, reaching for his phone. You know, I should delete this video now. Her head snapped up. You should. He grinned. But where's the fun in that? Amanda's fingers curled into fists. You promised. Did I? He laughed, tossing the phone onto the bed. You should know better than to trust a fraudster. Her heart pounded. Brian. He leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Relax. As long as you stay obedient, no one ever has to see it. Amanda felt like screaming. And then, A knock at the door. A loud, heavy knock. Her breath hitched. Brian frowned. Then, a voice. Deep, commanding. Brian, open this door. Amanda's blood turned to ice. It was Chief Douglas. Brian's face lost all amusement. He sat up, running a hand through his hair. Shit. Amanda backed away. Did you send it? She whispered. Brian shot her a sharp look. No. The knocking grew louder. And then, the door handle turned. This story is getting intense. Before you continue, drop your country in the comments. I want to see where my listeners are tuning in from. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Part 2. The door handle rattled. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. He's coming in. Brian jumped up from the bed, grabbing his phone. His face was pale now. No trace of the arrogance he had worn just moments ago. Amanda, he hissed, go to the bathroom. Now. She didn't move. The knocking turned into pounding. Brian, open this damn door. Chief Douglas's voice was sharp, commanding. Brian grabbed Amanda's wrist, his fingers digging into her skin. Go. Now. Her legs felt like stone, but she moved. Just as she reached the bathroom door, Brian took a deep breath and unlocked the main door. The second it opened, Chief Douglas stormed in. Amanda pressed her back against the bathroom wall, heart racing. She could hear everything. What the hell took you so long to open the door? Chief Douglas demanded. His voice was thick with suspicion. Brian chuckled, but it sounded forced. Relax, Dad. I was asleep. Asleep? Douglas's tone darkened. Dressed like this? And why's the room so damn warm? Amanda clamped a hand over her mouth. He knows something is off. The bed creaked as Brian sat down. Dad, what is this about? Douglas's voice lowered. I got an anonymous message. Brian stiffened. What kind of message? There was a long pause. Then Douglas spoke again, his voice dangerously quiet. Someone sent me a video, Brian. Amanda's stomach twisted. A video? Brian's fingers tightened around his phone. He forced a laugh. Dad, you get crazy messages all the time. People love stirring trouble. Douglas's footsteps grew closer. This one wasn't just some random message. Silence. Then, the sound of something being placed on the table. Amanda couldn't see, but she knew. Douglas had brought proof. I saw this, Brian, Douglas said, and I need you to explain. Brian hesitated. Then, with an easy, practiced confidence, he chuckled. You know what? Let's see what this nonsense is. Amanda could hear the video playing. Her own voice. The low, breathy whispers. The sheets rustling. Brian's deep murmurs. Everything. The sound cut off. Then, silence. It stretched long, thick, suffocating. Amanda couldn't breathe. Then Douglas spoke. Who is she? Brian exhaled. Dad, it's not what you think. Douglas slammed something, probably his fist, onto the table. Who is she, Brian? Brian hesitated for just a second too long. Douglas's voice dropped into a low growl. Where is she? Amanda's entire body turned cold. She heard movement. A chair scraping. A heavy, deliberate step toward the bathroom. Brian spoke quickly. Dad, calm down. You don't have to. Too late. The door swung open, and there she was. Amanda, standing in the dim bathroom light. Frozen, face to face with her husband. The world stopped. Douglas stared at her, his face unreadable. Amanda's throat was dry. She tried to speak, to explain, but no words came. Slowly, Douglas turned his head toward Brian. His eyes burned with something dangerous. You, he said, his voice disturbingly calm. You did this. Brian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Douglas took a step forward. Brian took one back. Amanda had seen her husband angry before. But this was different. Deadly. You think I don't know who you are, Brian? Douglas said softly. You think I don't know about your little scams? The fraud? The money you steal? Brian's confidence cracked. Dad. Shut up. Brian flinched. Douglas glanced at Amanda. Just for a second. His expression unreadable. Then back at his son. You want to betray me? Douglas said, taking another step forward. Fine. But you made one mistake, Brian. Brian's breath hitched. What mistake? Douglas smiled. And it was terrifying. You thought I didn't know. Brian barely had time to react. Douglas lunged. The punch came fast. Brian's head snapped to the side, his body stumbling backward onto the bed. Before he could get up, Douglas grabbed him by the collar and dragged him onto the floor. "You think you can take what's mine?" Douglas's voice was low, seething. Brian gasped, struggling. "Dad, stop. You want to be a man?" Douglas snarled. "Let's see how much of a man you are now." Another punch. Brian groaned, his lips splitting. Amanda pressed herself against the bathroom wall, her breath shallow. She should stop this. She should say something. But she didn't, because some part of her, the part Brian had broken, wanted this to happen, wanted him to pay. Douglas shoved Brian onto his back, standing over him like a lion over a wounded prey. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into his pocket. Amanda's blood ran cold. A gun. Brian's eyes widened. "Dad!" Douglas clicked the safety off. "Give me one good reason," he said, aiming the barrel directly at Brian's head. "Why I shouldn't erase you right now." Brian's hand shook. His cocky mask was gone. "Because..." His voice cracked. "I'm your son." Douglas stared at him. The gun didn't move. Amanda's heart pounded so hard it hurt. Douglas breathed out slowly. "Exactly." Then, he lowered the gun. But not out of mercy. His voice was ice when he spoke again. "You're not dying tonight, Brian. That would be too easy." Brian blinked. "What?" Douglas stepped back. "Pack your things. You're leaving." Brian sat up, wiping blood from his lip. "You can't be serious." Douglas's face was stone. "You have 1 hour to get out of my sight. After that, you're not my son anymore." Amanda's breath caught. Brian laughed weakly, shaking his head. "You're bluffing. You need me." Douglas smirked. "I own you, boy. Every cent, every luxury, every fake empire you built. It's mine." Brian's face paled. Douglas turned to Amanda. She stiffened. He stared at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he walked past her, heading for the door. At the threshold, he paused. 1 hour, Brian, he said coldly. Then he left, leaving Amanda and Brian alone in the wreckage. Silence. Brian wiped his mouth, spitting blood onto the floor. Then, slowly, he looked up at Amanda. His expression had changed. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was the prey. "You?" he whispered. His voice was thick with realization. Amanda tilted her head. "What?" Brian swallowed hard. "You set me up." She smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. Part 3. Brian's eyes stayed locked on Amanda. His breathing was uneven, his lips still bleeding from his father's punch. But it wasn't the pain that made him tremble. It was her. Amanda stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "I set you up," she repeated, her voice smooth, almost amused. Brian swallowed hard, his atoms apple bobbing. You planned this. You wanted this to happen." She tilted her head, her eyes sharp like a predator sizing up its next meal. "Brian," she whispered, leaning in slightly, "do you really think you were the only one playing a game?" His jaw clenched. "You think you won?" Amanda smiled. "I know I did." Brian shot up from the floor, but the moment he moved, Amanda raised a hand, slowly, deliberately. He froze, because between her fingers, she held something small. A USB drive. Brian's stomach twisted. "What is that?" Amanda ran her thumb over the device, her expression unreadable. "Let's call it insurance," she murmured. Brian's fingers curled into fists. "Amanda." She gave him a slow, mocking look. "Stepson." His nostrils flared. "What did you do?" Amanda let out a small laugh. "Oh, Brian." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Then she pressed play, and Brian's own voice filled the room. "You think you can refuse me? I own you, Amanda. If you don't do what I say, I'll destroy your life. You belong to me now." His own threats, his own arrogance, his own downfall, his face drained of color. Amanda raised an eyebrow. "Sound familiar?" Brian's breath came fast, panicked. He snatched the phone from her hand, but it was too late. Amanda smirked. "I sent copies to your father." Brian's entire body went still. Amanda took a step closer, lowering her voice. "And the police?" The room turned suffocatingly silent. Brian stared at her, his hands gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then suddenly, he laughed. Low, bitter, broken. "You think this is over?" he murmured, shaking his head. You have no idea what you've started." Amanda remained unfazed. "I think I ended something, actually." Brian took a step closer, his voice lowering. "You don't know what I'm capable of." Amanda's eyes glimmered with something dark. "And you don't know who you just messed with." For the first time, Brian saw it. She was different now. Not the woman he had blackmailed. Not the victim he had toyed with. But something far more dangerous. Amanda smiled one last time, stepping back toward the door. "1 hour, Brian," she whispered, throwing his father's words back at him. Then she turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own ruin. My billionaire stepson blackmailed me to cheat on his father with him. Until this happened, Part 4. Brian stood frozen, his mind racing. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out every other sound. Amanda had turned the tables on him. Him, the one who always controlled the game. The one who always won. But not this time. He gritted his teeth, gripping the phone in his hand. His father, his own father, had heard the recordings. The police had them too. His perfect life, his power, everything he had built was slipping through his fingers like sand. His hands clenched into fists. No, this wasn't over. Amanda thought she had won, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. Brian turned sharply, grabbing his laptop. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he accessed his hidden accounts. He had money stashed away in places no one could trace. If Amanda thought she could ruin him, she was wrong. She was dead wrong. Amanda walked down the marble hallway, her heart still pounding. She kept her expression calm, but inside, she could feel the weight of everything pressing against her chest. She had won this round, but Brian wasn't the type to let things go. She needed to be ready. Her phone buzzed. A message. She glanced down. Unknown number. "You think you've won? You're playing with fire, Amanda. And fire burns." She exhaled slowly. "Let him try." Amanda slipped her phone into her pocket and pushed open the heavy glass doors, stepping out into the night. The cold air bit at her skin, but she didn't shiver. Instead, she smiled. Brian had always thought he was untouchable, that he could use people, control them, break them. But now, for the first time, he was the one who was afraid. Inside the mansion, Brian's face twisted with rage. He picked up his phone and made a call. "Find out where she is," he snapped. "I don't care what it takes. Do it now." A pause. Then a voice on the other end. "Understood." Brian lowered the phone and exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to calm down. Amanda thought she had him cornered, but she had underestimated him, because Brian always had one last move. And this time, he wasn't playing fair. What a twist. If you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories. And hey, let me know in the comments, what would you have done in this situation?